Hello, and today I'm going to be showing you a all-out battle royale between all major language groups in the world. We have the Germanics, the Latins, the Slavs, the Hungars, the Baltics, the Ugrics, the Turks, the Persians, Arabics. There's a lot. There's the Han, the Mongols, the Koreans. There is an absurd amount here, and obviously there's not nearly enough, especially in Africa, India, and Indonesia. I could have put significantly more rather than consolidate regions like Angola under certain other groups. That's simply because I don't want to have 100, and I simply don't know enough about these regions to make it. This is based off of some sites I saw online and my own personal knowledge, so hopefully it's not too bad. But I think that's about what the language groups look like. So we can go ahead and begin with a North American or Germanic invasion of Quebec. This would really not be much of a challenge. They have a minor standing army compared to the USA and Canada too, I guess. After this, the US would start major moves down south into Mexico, who is currently fighting a one-on-one with the US until South America can send its forces up north. We also see the US island hopping a bit in the Caribbean into the Bahamas and to eventually recapture Puerto Rico. However, South America is not slacking. The Latins are pushing around to consolidate the continent, destroying many minor groups, including the North American possessions in Guyana. From here, the front line would stabilize a bit. Obviously, the US has the advantage here in the long term and would slowly push down south, but that war would take a while. Moving over to Africa, the Sub-Saharans would see major progress capturing South Africa and Madagascar. These are not important regions to just about anyone. Madagascar was all on their own over there, and they have consolidated an absurd amount of countries compared to an undefended South Africa, as they have more important things to do in North America, and especially in Europe, where Germany is surrounded. They may also begin some invasions up north into Nigeria, Chad, and Tanzania. Meanwhile, we would see the Nigerians fully destroy this small group, which I have no idea what it is, what language it is. I honestly don't know, but they're there, and they capture it. They also start to push the Arabs, who have a lot of fronts to worry about, out of Sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, that area is going to be a major fight. We also see this little yellow group here, which consists of a lot of random countries, start fights just about everywhere. I mean, they're surrounded, and they are without a doubt one of the weaker countries in the region. They control some of the poorest regions in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, down south in Uganda. These are very, very poor regions with minor armies. Compare that to this Ethiopia here, who really doesn't even deserve these lands. But it looked too bad if I gave those to the Arabs, so they got lucky. They got the extra land because it looked absolutely terrible. And because of that, they're not going to start absolutely smashing in on this little light green group over here. They will not last long against Ethiopian, Nigerian, and Sub-Saharan attacks. Meanwhile, in India, the northern Hindu plains would start some major progress down south. They are significantly stronger, however, they do have to contest with the Persians. The Tibetans shouldn't be much of an issue. I'm going to call it Tibetans even though its power is mainly in Myanmar. I did not know those two went together. I found that online on an official website, so apparently those two language groups go together. Don't blame that on me. They would also start some progress there, as India is far more powerful than Myanmar and Tibet combined. Meanwhile, Thailand would be making progress into Myanmar, along with having a very heated war with Vietnam. These two are regional rivals, and Thailand has expanded significantly, even into the Guangxi region of China, which I also did not know about. Seems kind of random, but apparently those two are linked. So their first goal would be to capture northern Vietnam, link their regions, and even start a slight push into Cambodia. Meanwhile, over in Indonesia and Malaysia, along with the Philippines, an incredibly populous state, would start a push into Thailand, but would mainly focus on Australia, swiftly capturing Guinea, as their simple population advantage would be far too much for Australia to handle on their own. Maybe once the Americans are able to send help, they'll be able to deal with it, but for now they have a pretty nice secured position. The Japanese would likely start some assaults up north to capture Sakhalin, to capture the Kuril Islands. But this would not be an important front for the Russians unless they started landing in Vladivostok, which will be captured by the Chinese far sooner. The Russians simply have more important things to worry about over in Eastern Europe, where the Slavs are going to make major gains, as two of their neighbors on this border are very, very weak. The Baltics won't last very long, and the Finno-Ugarians, I believe, will also not last very long. Finland is completely on their own and is actually fighting on two sides here, which would lead to their swift capitulation and the consolidation of Slavic influence in Eastern Europe. The Germanics would actually probably be able to hold here if Norway and Sweden dedicated themselves fully to this front. I don't know if they would, but if they do, they will be able to hold it. Sadly, on the mainland, Germany is completely surrounded. This is beyond a two-front war at this point. They're fighting mainly the Slavs in the Latin bloc over in Western Europe, who would quickly start to make progress, pushing up into the Benelux, which is mostly plains, whilst even pushing slightly into the Swiss and Austrian mountains through Italy. Italy, however, would mainly focus their strength on the Balkans, capturing Croatia, and starting advances there. Meanwhile, the Slavs would focus on defeating Romania to link up their Balkan and Eastern European territories. And then there's the Hungarians, who have strengthened slightly, especially in border territories, but it just simply would not be nearly enough. Romania would capture their little exclave there, and they would not last very long. Especially Germanic and Slavic assaults would absolutely decimate their nation from the north, south, east, and west. That's not a winning fight. Back to North America, the battle would be long, but at the end of the day, the US is here fighting with far more modern, far larger army compared to the South Americans, who, although powerful, just simply aren't as strong as the US. The Americans would also focus a large amount of strength on fully capturing the Caribbean to secure complete naval dominance and cut them off from aid coming from Western Europe, leaving South America pretty much in a 1v1 against North America. Meanwhile, Germany would be continuously collapsing faster and faster. They're simply on too many fronts, and the British would send help, but I highly doubt it would be enough. The Slavs completely gained control of Eastern Europe, while starting their own advances into Germany, managing to capture Berlin, whilst the Latins capture the rest. One issue for the Slavs, however, is that they also have to deal with an eastern front, with a southern front, with an absurd amount of fronts. So this would mainly actually be Poles, Ukrainians fighting over here, compared to the Russians fighting in the east and in the south. So the Germanics would hold Scandinavia and mainly focus their efforts there, while the British would plan naval invasions. However, I doubt they would go off with the entire Latin bloc being ready. They're pretty cut off. They're in a pretty decent position. So they would likely start pushing back the Slavs slowly but surely. Especially in the Balkans, where Italy's focused, they would make progress. Albania would not stand a chance. They would fall quickly. And even Greece would start to struggle. Meanwhile, the Turkic peoples would be seeing major gains. Their first goal would be to link up this massive Central Asian landmass, or Stanistan, with the actual Turkey and Azerbaijan. As much as it may seem like these Central Asian territories are more important, Turkey is actually likely where they would focus more, as it is the far more important region of the empire. So they would make much progress into Greece, capturing many islands and securing their control, while also starting offensives into Bulgaria, fully capturing Armenia and Georgia, along with starting advances along the Caucasus Mountains and into the Kurdish region. And now the Arabs, who I haven't really talked about much yet, they would be having an okay time. Israel is completely surrounded, and although they're military strong, it would not be enough. Meanwhile, the Arabs will focus on Eastern Africa and Northeastern Africa, reclaiming their lands and taking advantage of weaker states, along with a major fight against the Ethiopians, who are even more powerful here than in real life, which would make them one of the, really not that much more powerful than any of the other countries in this world, but definitely a problem, especially with mountains being included. The Arabs would also completely liberate Chad, or at least their regions of Chad, whilst these sub-Saharans would manage to capture the rest. From here, Ethiopia would actually mainly focus their forces against the sub-Saharans, which is just what I'm going to call them because it's too many countries to count, too many countries to say, managing to push down into Eastern Africa significantly and secure the region. Meanwhile, the Nigerians would continue to push up the western coast, which is really not where the Arabs would be focusing their strength. Maybe once they start to get to Morocco, then they'll start to meet real resistance, but currently it's just not a lot. And seeing as they're not facing a lot of resistance there, they would be able to heavily focus on fighting the sub-Saharans, who are seemingly being targeted for no apparent reason other than they are very, very strong. Even though they would be extremely unstable, we're just going to ignore that. These are countries now. Yep. The Arabs and the Persians would also be having some problems, but I actually see the Arabs coming out here, as the Persians are surrounded by equal, if not superior, countries, so they may not survive for the longest period of time. However, Russian troops would start to push against the Turks. They really don't stand a chance against the bulk of the Russian army. As I said, the Eastern Europeans are handling Germany. The Balkans are handling the Balkans. The Russians captured Finland, captured the Baltics, and now they're focusing on Central Asia. They believe if they can capture this entire region, that would give them enough of a benefit to just hold there and be able to fully focus on Europe for the future. They would also be abandoning Eastern Asia. It's just untenable. Meanwhile, the Han, or just China, would be capturing all of Guangxi, pushing down south into Thailand and into Vietnam, not Myanmar, into Tibet, and basically in all regions. They would have one of the more powerful armies, and they would be quite angry about all the land they lost. I doubt Mongolia would last very long. They gained a lot of land in Manchuria and in Inner Mongolia from this, but it's not the most important land in the world, and even if it was, China's simply stronger in every way. Meanwhile, the Koreans would start an offensive. The North Korean and South Korean armies are both incredibly strong in their own right, so combined, they would likely be able to defeat China, at least in the short term. Meanwhile, Japan is focusing a lot more navally and on securing the Pacific. Down in Australia, I doubt they would fall. They have American naval backing, but many of these islands would likely fall, whilst the Indonesians start to focus more and more on Thailand, which seems to be the area where they're making the most gains, even nearing Bangkok. Mainly thanks to Chinese pressure in the north, Thailand is falling apart. Meanwhile, India, although this would take a long time, I'm just going to say they won in the south because eventually they would. And with that, they could now fully focus on the northern border, where they would make massive gains against Iran, minor gains against the Turks, and no gains along the Himalayas because it is a massive mountain range. And if you ever think they would fight there just for a few extra tall peaks, that is just wrong. At most, they would send out a few expeditions. Meanwhile, the Turks would continue to attempt to unite their fronts, which they would do successfully, but it simply doesn't matter, as Russian forces in the region are overwhelming them completely. They are failing to defend on most fronts, and the Russians are pushing further and further east, where they team up with the Chinese to fully crush Mongolia. This allows China to focus more on the Turks, who are really falling apart in Central Asia, and it also allows them to push well, their newly gained supposedly allies who they work together with the Russians in the east. They could then solely focus on Korea for the northern front, as Russia would be out of supply and really would not be attempting to guard these regions, allowing them to make minor progress along the peninsula, but I doubt it would fall anytime soon unless Japan takes some action. Rather than invade Korea, who's gonna fall anyways, they decide to invade Taiwan, which would work and is a very important region. It's rich, it has a lot of factories, it is a very important region, and it would secure their dominance of the seas. Even if their navy is slightly inferior to China's, or actually a decent amount inferior to China's, they would manage to secure control of the region. They would also somehow break the border in Sakhalin and reach the sea. From here, moving back to the Americas, I'm not even gonna talk about it. I'm just gonna slowly make the North Americans gain more and more progress. They're now down next to Honduras, and it's even possible that the US, in an effort to relieve a lot of their oil problems, decides to invade northern Venezuela and Colombia, which would just finish off South America. I doubt North America will get past the rainforest. It'll simply be too hard to fight there in unknown terrain against enemies who are well prepared, hopefully, and more familiar with the terrain. Thus, North America would be able to start focusing on other regions. They may send some help to Scandinavia, which would aid the Swedes and the Norwegians in pushing into the Kola Peninsula, and that whole region as a whole, along with maybe a recapture of Denmark eventually, however not yet, and even possibly a naval invasion of eastern Russia. Obviously it shows over here on the map, but it's also way over here, where they would manage to capture some frankly unimportant regions of eastern Russia, which I doubt would be defended. It's more of a prestige hit, as they are currently fighting Russia in the Nordics, and they want a distraction. Moving back over to China, once again, this would take years, but since I don't want to map it out every single time the border moves slightly, we're going to say China has secured much of Southeast Asia, especially in Thailand, where they're now going up against Indonesia, who has actually gained massively from this. The Philippines and Malaysia are very important regions. Their resources are grand. They have a massive population. Maybe I'm overestimating them, but I think they would start winning, and winning well. Even against China and India, as this is basically their only front line, they can focus all of their strength there. Australia is never going to attempt an invasion. They would fail. They're just trying to hold and not die. Thus, they could focus completely on this region and likely win there. Meanwhile, the Indians would be pushing for the whole subcontinent. As with Persia fracturing, fighting this many enemies is just not going to work out, and eventually they will fall. This will give India an even larger front line against the Tibetans, which will only speed up their progress. Like I said, mountains, horrible to push through, jungles. This would be very, very difficult for the Indians, but with the Chinese in the north, they would have very few, if not no defenses to fight against this. The Chinese would also secure a lot of Central Asia, as the Turks have basically given up on it and are now focusing on their more core regions. By that I mean Turkey's going off and capturing southern Russia, which is a somewhat rebellious region. Meanwhile, the Russians managed to fully secure Central Asia, although in the end, instead of destroying a front, this has actually managed to open a new front against the Chinese. And whilst the Russians were focusing on that, the Latin bloc over here has made a lot of progress against them in the east. With the fall of Czechia and much of Poland, their armies are falling apart. And if Russia does not redirect attention over there soon, it is not going to end well. Meanwhile, this coalition of Western European countries is doing very well for themselves. They're in a pretty good position, honestly. And by that I mean they're over here on their own little corner. They can hold the naval advantage against the Arabs. They can fight off British naval attacks. And most of their border is now ocean, which gives them a solid front over in the east against the Slavs and now the Turks. Meanwhile, the Turks would start major fights against the Arabs, who are also quite overwhelmed at the moment, managing to capture parts of Syria, whilst Iran will at this point fully capitulate to Indian, Turkic, and especially Arab attacks. Meanwhile, the Arabians, after securing Persia, would focus on East Africa. They would attempt to reach Djibouti to take complete control of the Red Sea, and they would be successful. However, they are now fighting in the Ethiopian mountains, which is really just not a great place to be fighting anyone at any time. The Nigerians would still be making gains over in the Sahara, but like I said, this is all not mountains. This is all plain desert. Honestly, if they really wanted to, they could probably capture all this, maybe even more. But I don't think they would even want to, because that is all useless, and it's just making it harder to push through. It's wasting their supplies. It's wasting everything. Meanwhile, the sub-Saharan Africans would be quickly pushing back. The Ethiopians are struggling quite massively, whilst they have a much more unified front and are able to push up, completely capturing Lake Victoria and capturing southern Somalia. This would eventually lead to the complete capitulation of Ethiopia. Once again, this would take years. They're fighting in mountains here. They're fighting against a lot of people, but eventually they would fall, leading to another language being out of this war. Also, Greece still exists. They managed to take control of Cyprus. That's gone now. That's not going to last. Now these are what the fronts are looking like. Honestly, currently, I would argue the Germanics are still... actually, they lost all of Europe. All of mainland Europe. I might have to give it to, the Chinese here. Maybe. Well, they've been doing the best out of anyone so far, at least. They would continue their progress south into Korea, slowly but surely. With the fall of Pyongyang, it is now just the south holding. Meanwhile, the Japanese would continue to pester the Russians by naval invading the east, around the Sea of Okhotsk. This wouldn't really affect the Russians much. This is all useless. But the Japanese really have nothing better to do, since they're just focusing on their islands and haven't really started a mainland front against somebody major like China yet, although they soon will. They also have a border with North America up here. Not much would happen. It's freezing, it's cold, nobody wants to fight there. I don't even know why they would invade there, but that's just how it is. Meanwhile, the Chinese would be making major gains. They have the local advantage against the Russians, and the Russians are simply overwhelmed. Their massive country is now proving to be a major downside, as the Chinese have captured the Trans-Siberian Railway and basically all infrastructure in the east. This leads to a very major Chinese state, which is absolutely destroying Russian eastern presence. This allows the Japanese to continue their advance along the sea until they eventually manage to secure a pretty good stronghold over the north. The Americans may also try something whilst trying to avoid conflict with Japan. They would push around, as Japan has the local advantage and they would likely win that engagement. Meanwhile, the Latin bloc, as I'm going to call it, is still pushing into Poland. The Russians are absolutely falling apart here. They simply don't have enough forces to cover every single front, which is massive. This is the downside to them being that large. They simply cannot hold all these fronts, and eventually Romania is fully liberated, leading to an even stronger front line against them. The Latins would also secure the rest of the Balkans, while slowly pushing back the Turks, although not fully to Istanbul. The Turks, meanwhile, are being pushed back by the Russians in Central Asia, as they still have large armies there, but especially by the Arabians, who would be looking to capture the rest of Persia and just about everything else. They would quickly start pushing back the Turks on their front, as they now have much more powerful enemies to face. The Arabians would also finally start to fight the Nigerians. This is obviously desert. This is just what it would look like on a map. Although slight, the push is still significant. Nigeria can't just walk in anymore. That's the message here. Meanwhile, in the Americas, exactly what I said earlier would be happening. Slow North American gains into, well, northern South America, eventually even managing to recapture northern Guyana. That war would go on for a while, but who's the strongest now? Arabs, Latin bloc in Europe, pretty strong. Chinese doing absolutely amazing, especially once the Chinese managed to finish off Korea. They now have a very, very good front. They have a large front, but they have a lot of men to fill it. And once India deals with Tibet, it's going to be far more unified. However, in the south, the Indonesians are still defeating the Chinese in almost every battle, as they are focusing their full attention on capturing Vietnam, rather than the Chinese, who have to focus on the Russians, the Indians, previously the Koreans, and them. Over in Europe, the Russian front would start to collapse. Russia, as we know, does not have the greatest military or the greatest logistics, so the Germanics would really, really manage to secure the Nordics by capturing Finland and possibly even recapturing Denmark. This would be difficult to hold, but not impossible. And if they can push back to Hamburg, I think that would be a good line for them to focus on. Meanwhile, the Latin bloc is just continuing to hammer into Russian lines. Russia has now lost most of their eastern allies and are now having to man the front themselves completely, which is really, really not going too well for them. Over in Africa, Nigeria would be starting to fall. The Sub-Saharans simply have an advantage as they have a unified front, which is incredibly important. Keep talking about it, very, very important. They do have a large one, but they are a very, very large country. And, well, once Nigeria falls, the rest of this is not the most powerful. Meaning that as soon as Nigeria capitulates, I have no doubt that the Arabs will take advantage and take a lot of the capitulated lands, even if they didn't themselves conquer it at first, or at the very least that they didn't capitulate it. This would lead to one large front between the Arabs and the Sub-Saharan Africans, which would slowly push to their advantage. They aren't the richest, still definitely not the richest, but the Arabs simply have more important things to deal with. And since the Europeans are winning in Africa, in Russia, and, well, the Danish invasion isn't really that pressing, they finally decide to deal with North Africa. In a joint invasion of Tunis and Morocco, they managed to capture all of Algeria and secure a major foothold, which is a very big hit to the Arabs, as once Tripoli falls, that's going to be all major cities in the north captured outside of Egypt. This will also secure the Mediterranean for the Latins, as, well, there's really nobody to contest them there anymore. They're also slowly pushing back the Turks on land, air, and sea. They've managed to capture Istanbul, and they are now on the peninsula itself. This means that the Arabs can now also start offensives against the Turks, managing to recapture even more land and push up into Iran. All Turkish divisions stuck in Central Asia will now die, as they simply have no way of reinforcing it. And soon enough, Turkey as a whole will die. Once again, this will take years, but assuming it doesn't end yet, they would eventually fall apart. We're now going to start to speed it up because, well, it's getting long enough. The Arabs would manage to capture a lot of the rest of the Turkish lands, including Cyprus, whilst the Latins would capture the rest. The next nation to capitulate may even be Japan, as, well, actually no, I think Japan would hold. Who would be next to fall? Honestly, maybe it would be the Russians, maybe it would be the Arabs. I doubt it would be the Arabs. Maybe the Japanese. Maybe the South Americans, part of the Latin bloc. I honestly don't know where it would go from here. Obviously, a lot has changed. The most powerful right now may actually be the Germanics. I mean, they have a very good position in the Americas. China and India are fighting each other a lot. Japan has a secured position, but maybe not for long. Indonesia actually has a pretty nice position. and the Arabs are fighting on too many fronts, especially against the Western Europeans, which they would not win. They would slowly be pushed back there, whilst Germanic influence over Northern Europe seems secured, and Russia is falling apart. I think honestly they would be the next to die, which may lead to Chinese and especially Western European victory. I am going to end it there because, from here it'd be stalemate, stalemate. All the weak nations are out. South America would eventually fall. Africa would probably end up being split by the Western Europeans and the Sub-Saharan Africans. India and China would just keep fighting until they all died. Indonesia may eventually capture Australia, but not soon. And China may eventually go for a landing in Japan. Or maybe they'll end up like the Mongols. Maybe they'll get bad luck and they'll all end up dying on the way to Japan. I honestly couldn't tell you, but I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.